The New Testament is most famous to all people, probably for the Gospels, but the majority of the New Testament are a number of letters which are attributed to St. Paul, although it's unclear whether he actually did write all of them. One of the letters, though, is the letter from Paul to Philemon. You might have missed this letter if you flick quickly through the New Testament, because it sits between Hebrews and Titus and is actually only one single page in writing, a total of 335 words. So probably one of the shortest books in the New Testament. And it's a letter that Paul wrote, a single letter to one person, which is a bit unusual for what we know about Paul. But it is thought that this letter is authentic because it's written in Paul's natural style, lots of words, very verbose. And it also acknowledges that it's being written from prison. And we know that Paul was imprisoned at least 7 times. It also implies it was towards the end of his ministry, but which time and which date when he was imprisoned, we do not know. It begins as usual with Paul's verbose greeting to Philemon, quite flattering actually in character. Philemon is clearly one of those people who ran a church house. Most of the churches in those days, in fact nearly all of them, were run from homes. They didn't have the buildings that we have in modern day Britain. So Philemon clearly ran a church house, a follower of Christ. His wife, Apphia, was also a Christian, and the letter is written to Philemon and acknowledges her presence too, and that of another Christian, Archippus. So the letter is about a runaway slave, a slave called Onesimus, or that's the name he becomes known as. Somehow this slave had been in Philemon's house and had escaped, run away, which was a major crime in those days. And he'd escaped to go and be with Paul in the prison. That seems a really funny type of escape. Slaves, of course, were prisoners in the households, so he chooses to run away to actually go to a prison, which seems a little bit bizarre, but there you go. But it is thought that Onesimus, as he becomes called, had probably heard the call of Christ. He'd probably listened to Paul preaching and listened to some of Paul's story, and he therefore had left his master's home and gone to serve Paul in prison. Because we have to remember the prisons of that day were nothing like the prisons today. The prisoners relied on friends, family, or other people to supply their everyday needs, their clothes, their paper, their writing materials, their food. Their very well-being relies on others, not like the prisons in England today. So Onesimus had run away from Philemon to serve Paul, both as a Christian and as a fellow brother, helping him through this time in prison. And Paul refers to Onesimus by saying, and it's a play on words, that once he was thought to be a useless slave, but now to Paul in prison, he's absolutely vital and essential. And he served Paul well in prison. And so from being a useless slave, he becomes useful, Onesimus. But Paul is pleading with Philemon to take Onesimus back into his house. Normally, a runaway slave, if captured and returned to the owner, would probably be beaten up or even killed. But Paul is appealing to Philemon for forgiveness for the slave, and also to say to Philemon, accept him back into your household as a fellow brother, no longer a slave, but an equal. Somehow this reminded me of the story of the prodigal son. When the son was sent back, there was feasting, there was joy, there was celebration. And I think that's what Paul is trying to say to Philemon. Accept Onesimus back. Forgive him for running away. Forgive him for any wrongdoing and for anything that he may owe you. Paul said he would pay, which is a bit ironic really, because Paul was in prison and really had no income whatsoever. But what I think Paul's saying to Philemon is accept your Christian brother back, welcome him into your home, love him and treat him as an equal. Forgiveness is the key. And Jesus, of course, himself preached often about forgiving. How many times would we forgive our brother? 70 times 7 or more. So Paul was really echoing Jesus' story. Take your fellow Christian brother back. Treat him as an equal. Forgive him everything that he may have done or not done in your household. So the letter really has so much depth and meaning within it. It stands alone, as I said before, so we don't actually know whatever happened to Onesimus. Did he go back to Philemon? Was he accepted into the Christian household? Did he become an equal? Some historians who've tried to discover what happened to Onesimus have actually thought that he eventually became the bishop of Ephesus. Now we know something about Ephesus because Paul also, of course, wrote to the Ephesians. So whether that's what happened to Onesimus, we do not know. But if it did, what a wonderful story. There he was, the runaway slave, ran away to hear the word of Christ, supported Paul in prison, sent back, and eventually continues the Christian story by becoming the bishop in Ephesus. Isn't that a wonderful tale of forgiveness and how it doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, whether you're rich or whether you're poor, because God welcomes everyone in his house. There's room for everyone at his table. And one day, that slave may have become the bishop. We do not know. But certainly he was a devoted Christian who risked his life by running away to be with Paul, but will have got his reward and his glory in heaven. One of the keys then to being a Christian is forgiveness. Think about that in your weeks ahead and today.